So I'm just, like many of you know, I'm getting over COVID, and one of the weird things is words. I've just been saying the wrong words at times, like I just did, saying wandering when I meant to say waiting, and I have no control over that. That's just a weird thing that has been happening to me. But the other day, we were talking about something, and I was saying somebody that we know, and I said, you know, over by where Michelle Obama lives.
Like she's our neighbor.
Like, yeah. So I'm very concerned about myself, and you should be too. So this is my first attempt at talking for a long time, and we'll see how this goes today, because the talking usually brings on coughing, but I think I'm over that now. So for the last year and a half or so, I've been working on a project, and I want to share what this project is with you and tell you that I've finished writing a book. And right now, I've been unsuccessful to this date at finding a publisher that thinks it's a good idea. So I don't know what's going to happen. I'm working with somebody right now who is has been an acquisitions editor and done a lot of that kind of stuff. And she's like rereading my stuff and saying, well, maybe you need to do this, that kind of stuff. So it's very much up in the air. But the idea behind the book came from an idea of Frederick Buechner's that meant a lot to me, which was Buechner used this concept, the stewardship of pain, and talked about Matthew 25 and the parable of the talents and what does it mean to be a steward of pain. That pain might be one of the things we're given in life, and burying it is one thing, like the person does in that parable that Jesus told, but somehow trading with it, somehow doing something with it. So what I've done in this book is I've interviewed people who I know have had great experiences of pain. And then I not only tell their story in each chapter, but then I process each story with somebody else who can bring insight and expertise into it. So for example, one of the stories that I did was Roger Nelson. He's preached here a couple of times. He's a friend of mine. His daughter is a member, Lauren. His dad was murdered in 1985. Some of you remember that. He was a Northwestern College history professor, Ron Nelson, and Roger was there when it happened in Chicago at Roseland Christian Ministries on St. Patrick's Day, right after the service. And so Roger told his story, and not just about the murder, but then about the trial, about the police lineup, and then the trial, and then his life since then. And in so many ways, that event has shaped and made Roger into a great minister. But he would trade all of that in a heartbeat to have none of that have happened. And then, for example, I processed that story with Dan Rooks, who you all know, a member of our church, a psychiatrist. And Dan was able to talk about trauma and what happens to our brains when trauma happens, and helped Roger actually understand the reactions that he had, the out-of-body experiences that he had, in the moment, the different reactions, as normal reactions when trauma happens. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me. So I've done a bunch of different ones, and what I thought I would share a bit of today, and I have way more material than I'm going to have time for, but if you don't mind me, I'm going to try to read, but I'll try to hopefully read in an engaging way. The last story that I did, the last person I interviewed, is somebody else that is familiar to, I'm sure, everyone here, and that was, I interviewed Nicholas Waltersdorf and talked to him about the death of his son, which happened in the 80s. And his son, you recall, he wrote a book called Lament for a Son. So I talked to him not only about that particular event, but then about his life afterwards. So I'm going to read a little bit of Nick Waltersdorf's story to you. And then I processed that, and I processed it with somebody that was very much not like a psychiatrist, which I had done earlier in the book, but I processed it with an artist by the name of Makoto Fujimura, who some of you may be familiar with also. And Mako and Nick are friends, and Mako has just incredible insight into this whole story. So you'll hear some of that too. So with your permission, I'm just going to kind of launch into this, and hopefully your eyes won't glaze over and you'll find this somewhat interesting. So Nicholas Waltersdorf has a formidable presence. Undimmed at age 89, with a full head of white hair, he possesses the serious, distinguished manner befitting the Noah Porter Professor Emeritus of Philosophical Theology at Yale University. He holds 2 advanced degrees from Harvard University, and in addition to Yale, was a faculty member at both Calvin College and the Free University of Amsterdam, and a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He's delivered named lecture series at several universities around the world, including Oxford, St. Andrews, Princeton, and Yale. He had a formative role in creating the Society of Christian Philosophers, has authored 25 books on subjects as diverse as epistemology, ontology, art and aesthetics, justice, political philosophy, and metaphysics. Yet for all that, he may be best known for his slim volume, Lament for a Son, published in 1987 following the tragic death of his son Eric in a climbing accident in Austria. Eric was 25 years old at the time of the accident. He'd been a bright child who excelled at school. Adventuresome and curious as a rising senior in high school, he traveled on his own to take a summer course in ceramics at Alfred University in upstate New York. Between his sophomore and junior years of college, Eric traveled to Japan with friends and freestyled their way through the country. In addition to his skill with ceramics, Eric was a talented musician, and he'd studied computer programming. He was excelling as a graduate student at Yale, supervising the discussion sections for the 700 undergraduate students in the introductory art history course. And at age 24, curated a show at Yale's British Art Museum. His dissertation focused on the origins of modern architecture, and in order to best study the work of the German architect Paul Schulze-Naumburg, Eric had rented rooms in Munich, which also put him close to his beloved Alps. Eric Waltersdorf loved mountain climbing. He died doing what he loved. Climbing solo fit Eric's venturesome personality. He took risks, did things independently, was always moving ahead. I would criticize him for driving too close to the car in front of him. His father said, that's the way he was. Eric died on June 11th, 1983, when Eric's German landlady called and said that Eric was dead. His father had an image of holding Eric's limp body in his arms. Then he felt both intense cold and burning pain. Nicholas Waltersdorf traveled to Europe to claim Eric's body and retrieve Eric's possessions. On the way home, he had 8 hours in the Luxembourg airport. I'd brought some things to read, Nick said, but I couldn't read. So I took out some paper and started to write. I'm a writer. That's what I do. And although he doubts a single sentence he wrote in the Luxembourg airport made it into Lament for a Son, the book's genesis happened that day. Instead of writing about grief, Nick expressed his grief. The book, he would say, is a cry of grief. Sometimes I think that happiness is over for me. My life is divided into before and after. What do I do now with my regrets? The pain of no more outweighs the gratitude of once was. Will it always be so? I didn't know how much I loved him until he was gone. Is love like that? There's a hole in the world now, Nick wrote, in the place where he was. There's now just nothing. The world is emptier. My son is gone. Only a hole remains, a gap, a void, never to be filled. In a sort of mockery, Eric's backpack and climbing boots were unharmed. The authorities in Austria suggested not looking at the body. Later at home, Nick's wife Claire insisted they see and touch Eric's body. She was right, Nick said. We saw him from the torso up. Perhaps his lower body was mangled. It was important to touch him, to see him. Not only are dead bodies disappearing from funerals in our death-denying culture, funerals are disappearing and being replaced by celebrations of life. We want to glide past death and not reckon with the bodies of the dead. Yet there is something elemental and primal about touching and seeing the dead. As Nick wrote, I pity those who never get a chance to see and feel the deadness of the one they love, who must think death but cannot sense it. To fully persuade us of death's reality and of its grim finality, our eyes and hands must rub against death's cold, hard body, body against body, painfully, knowing death with mind alone is less than fully knowing it. True to his academic nature, Nick soon collected a pile of books on grief so he could understand what was happening. He found he could not read them. I was not interested in death, he said. I was interested in Eric's death. Lewis Smedes, the author of several popular books of practical theology, gave the Walterstorffs invaluable advice. Lewis Smedes said that you've heard that there is company in misery. Nick said, he told us that wasn't true, that instead grief isolates. This gave us the understanding and freedom to experience grief individually at our own pace. Claire might be deep in grief on a day I felt like working in the garden, or vice versa. Each of our children grieved differently. We had a common source of grief, but my grief was not their grief. Lament for a Son has no chapters. There is no linear or narrative, continuous flow to it. Its ragged nature reflects the ragged nature of grief. There's plenty of white space. Nick uses white space the way a poet uses white space. Room is created for readers to supply their own thoughts. Over the years, Nick came to see the white space as silence. Not every feeling can be expressed in words. He did not write the book like he would typically write a philosophical book. He did not examine grief in a detached, scholarly manner. He simply described his feelings. The words just came to me, he wrote. He wrote in pictures. One of the most memorable lines is, sorrow is no longer the islands, but the sea. He resolved not to include any pious platitudes or false reassurances, only his absolute, honest feelings. I initially thought there was something unique about me because I had lost a child, Nick said. I soon learned that I had a lot of company on the mourner's bench. Since the publication of the book, he's heard from hundreds and hundreds of grieving parents. The circle soon widened, and he began hearing from people who had experienced loss of any kind. I shall never forget, he said, a woman in a church who said to me, my loss is that my son will never become what I hoped he would be. I never saw her again or learned what was behind her comment, but somehow the book spoke to her. One day, Nick ran into a friend, and I'll actually tell you who this is because he was a member of this church. It was Max Dupree. One day in the Grand Rapids airport, Nick ran into Max, and Max was reading Lament for a Son, and I asked him why he was reading the book because he knew that Max hadn't lost any of his children. And Max said, well, I bought copies of it for all my children and gave it to him. I wondered why, and he said, don't you see, Nick? It's a love song. That sounds like something Max would have said, right? And Nick said, I suppose it is. Nick initially wrote as his own therapeutic exercise, and as time passed, he began to think his thoughts might be helpful to others. I began to wonder if there might be something redemptive in it. If what I was writing might somehow make something redemptive out of this experience. I resolved not to disown my grief, but to seek to own it redemptively, to own it in such a way that might bring about some good. So that's really kind of what the theme of my whole book is about not just having these experiences, which so many of us have, but what can we do with it? What do we do with it? Still, Nick had doubts. He happened to be at the printing plant of the William B. Erdman's company, the book's publisher, and saw a pallet with hundreds of copies of Lament for a Son stacked on it in preparation for shipping. An image came to him. He saw himself lying flat in a casket or on a stretcher with his intestines exposed as people filed past gawking at him. What had he done? Despite his initial misgivings, the book became one of the most popular pastoral theology books ever published by Erdman's. It has sold exponentially more than Nick's many volumes on philosophy. And I talked to, I didn't put this in here, but I talked to Jan Pott, who was the managing editor at Erdman's those days, and Jan Pott said that Lament for a Son has sold over 100,000 copies, and all of Nick's other books combined don't add up to that much. It's just amazing. Western society is fixated on what Nick calls disowning grief. He points out the language we use. Put it behind you. Get over it. Get on with your life, as language of disowning. The goal of grieving is not to move on from it, to somehow overcome it. The goal is to own it and to take it in to your being. As time passes, the goal shifts from not only owning one's grief, but owning it redemptively, to use it to help others. Surely this is what Frederick Buechner means by the phrase, the stewardship of pain. And I can't help, I'm going to embarrass you for a second, I can't help but notice Don Bruging sitting here. In the story I tell about Roger Nelson, Roger writes about how important Don, or talks about how important, you probably don't know this, he talks about how important Don was to him after his dad's death, and how Don didn't say anything, just embraced him when he came back to the seminary, and how much that meant to him. So that's what it means, that out of the depths of your own pain, somehow to be able to reach out to another person. Much has been written about the stages of grief, with grief being described as a process one goes through with the end result that one can move on to the rest of one's life. Nick rejects those ideas. I used to have people come to see me in my office who had experienced loss and were frustrated because they weren't experiencing the stages of grief. They thought something was wrong with them. There wasn't anything wrong with them other than they believed that grief comes in stages. I read a few lines to Nick from something I'd found online instructing preachers in how to talk to their congregations about suffering. The gist of it was that suffering and death are tools God uses to shape and mold us. The article spoke about meekly submitting to the rod of the Father and being quiet under God's smiting rod because it is training for holiness. Although the language of this particular article seemed extreme, there is a Christian tradition of viewing suffering as God's tool for soul making. And I asked Nick what he thought of that. I find it grotesque and repugnant, he said sharply. What did Eric's untimely death do for Eric's soul? And the idea that God would cause Eric's foot to slip for my moral and religious improvement is grotesque. I may have grown deeper through my suffering, but to suggest that God employs the death of children to improve their parents is repugnant. 38 years after Eric's death, Nick still grieves for his son. The pain is not as intense, but it remains. The hole never closes, Nick said. You repair it, but it does not completely close. How could it? Am I supposed to forget, Eric? I'm going to jump ahead a little bit.
Jeff,
Yeah, Marilyn.
I had the distinct privilege and honor of meeting the Walterstorffs in Honduras in 2020 at an Association for a More Just Society conference. And there they were sitting at the breakfast table. I kind of went to this conference just to meet them.
Stalking. Stalking. You were stalking, yes.
Stalking?
Yes.
No. So I worked up the courage after they had finished eating and introduced myself. And I was with my sister, and we introduced ourselves. And every time I met them, which was maybe about 5 times with Claire, 3 times with Nicholas, he always, what's the right word? Demurred to Claire. He always directed the conversation to his wife, and then it was the 2 of us. But the first time at that breakfast, and 3, I'm not sure about these times, 3 out of the 5 times, Claire mentioned Eric. First time I met him,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was just normal, natural.
Yeah. Almost 40 years. Yeah. A few years ago, Nick was invited to participate in what turned out to be one of the most impactful teaching experiences of his life. Calvin College had established a new campus inside the Hanlon State Prison for Men outside of Ionia, Michigan, about 25 miles east of the main campus. Some inmates at Hanlon are full Calvin students earning bachelor's degrees. Lament for a Son had been assigned as a textbook in an introduction to philosophy course, and Waltersdorf entered the prison to discuss the book. 17 of the 20 inmates in the class were serving life sentences. The inmates read passages from the book aloud and spoke of how it gave words to what they felt. They confessed what they had done, Nick said. One would say, I killed my best friend. Another would say, I murdered my wife, and so on. I'd never experienced anything like it. I came to see that prisons are houses of lament, houses of grief. I felt my common humanity with these men profoundly. Waltersdorf returns to the prison annually to discuss the book. At age 89, Nicholas Waltersdorf thinks about his own death. There are things he'd like to say to Eric, but he does not claim to know how God's new creation will work. I have no idea, he said. There are billions of people for God to deal with. I think about what's next, but I do not know what's going to happen. It is a mystery. In the months following Eric's death, Nick found comfort in rereading T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets and was especially struck by the line, in my end is my beginning. In my end is my beginning. Nick also found resonance with John Donne's sentiment that any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. The paradox and mystery of in my end is my beginning parallels the paradox and mystery of owning grief and making it redemptive. And if any death diminishes, how much more the death of a beloved child. Nick was indeed wounded by the loss of Eric. But through lament for a son and his willingness to speak over the decades of his particular experience of grief, Nicholas Waltersdorf has been an agent of love, compassion, and mercy in our broken and battered world. At the end of lament, he notes that the radiance which emerges from acquaintance with grief as a blessing to others is familiar, though perplexing. How can we treasure the radiance while struggling against what brought it about? How can we thank God for suffering's yield while asking for its removal? until that day when God wipes every tear from our eyes, when mourning and crying and pain are no more and death is no more. We live in the mystery. So as I mentioned, I thought long and hard about who to invite to comment on Nicholas Waltersdorf's story. And I wondered who had the stature. I was reticent to invite another philosopher or theologian. I feared I might wind up refereeing a debate about theology, divine impassibility and divine pathos. And I actually said to myself, I've got to think creatively about this. And the word creative brought to mind a creative person, Mako Fujimura. Mako is a visual artist who has worked and lived and studied in both Japan and the United States, and his paintings have been exhibited worldwide. He's also a deep thinker and has written several books about the intersections and sometimes collisions of the worlds of art and faith. I was not surprised to learn that Mako and Nick know each other, or that Nick, an art collector, owns a couple of Mako's paintings, and they were very comfortable being paired together. I probably first read Lament for a Son close to 30 years ago, Mako said. Then after I experienced the trauma of 9/11 firsthand, my pastor gave Lament to me, and I read it again. Someone else gave it to me a while ago after I went through a divorce, so I read it again. People keep giving it to me. I'm not sure how many times I have read it, maybe 5. And I've also given several copies to people suffering pain or trauma or unexpected loss. Nick's words are powerful and intimate and speak more clearly than any discourse on pain or loss. But he said, I'm not sure that Lament for a Son was actually my first exposure to Nick. I read his book, Art in Action, in the 1990s, and we met when we participated in a conference together. I appreciate Nick's approach to art. Not only is he a great philosopher, but he's also a fine carpenter. He's from generations of people who use their hands to build their homes and furniture. His understanding of art as making is somatic. And although he is a very high-level thinker, he translates philosophy to a deeply communal level, which is very helpful to someone like me who navigates both an art world that is disembodied and even Gnostic, and a church world that can be Gnostic as well when we lean into super rationalized ways of understanding the gospel as information only. I don't fit into the machinations of either of those worlds. I often experience being marginalized. I'm not alone. Many creatives are marginalized. Nick brings an important connection between work with hands and art and speaks powerfully to us. Early on the morning of September 11th, 2001, Mako left his loft apartment in southern Manhattan, 3 blocks away from the World Trade Center. His children were in school that morning, in the shadow of the World Trade Center. After the attacks, Mako searched for hours to find his family. His subway train had to backtrack to avoid disaster, and while in the subway, he felt the rumble of the first tower falling overhead. The subway train backtracked 2 miles, and when Mako exited the subway, the Twin Towers were gone. I thought I lost my children that day, Mako said. To say it was traumatic is a great understatement. My family witnessed the devastation. My children are ground zero children. We moved from that place, or we saw that smoldering hole for months and looked out at ground zero for the next decade until we moved from that place. The amount of loss in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. is incalculable. 9/11 pushed me over the edge. In the months that followed, T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, the same poems Nick turned to after the death of his son, became my guidebook. It became my map to navigate a really confusing time. Eliot's 4 quartets is the consummation of everything Eliot had ever written. He was so satisfied with the 4 quartets that he did not write another poem It was the end of poetry for him. Some of the sections of the poems are dark. They're really the nadir of Western poetry. When you go through darkness, as I did following 9/11, Eliot made absolutely the right sense to me. He spoke clearly to the darkness I was going through. It's apparent he also spoke to Nick. Eliot pushes the boundaries of hope, and the fact that Nick could conclude Lament for a Son with Eliot's line from the four quartets, "In my end is my beginning," is extraordinarily hopeful. It's an amazing statement of faith to end with that line. It takes an enormous level of self-understanding and honesty to move through the purgatorial fires of pain, to move away from disaffection and distraction and get to the other side. Eliot's poem does that. Nick does that by being brutally honest about the pain, and then, like Eliot, expressing hope that isn't simply a projection, hope that doesn't deny or lose the immediacy of the moment. In addition to painting, Mako also practices the Japanese art of kintsugi. Kintsugi masters repair ceramics used in Japanese tea ceremonies. Kin means gold, and sugi means to mend or reconnect. Using Japanese lacquer and gold to repair cracks and fractures, kintsugi masters do not just repair or restore broken teaware, they create something new. Ceramic bowls, which may have previously had a uniform, indistinguishable appearance, are transformed. After the kintsugi process, they're all unique, since no two pieces of ceramic break in the same way. Kintsugi is an art form akin to the theology of the new creation that is so prevalent in the New Testament. After trauma to a bowl or a person, you can never return to the way things were, but something new can be created. Think of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. These are new creation moments. It's amazing that after all he suffered, he came back as a human being. He could have been anything. Yet he came back as not only a human, but a wounded human. He wasn't the same. People didn't recognize him immediately. This is the unimaginable reality of the new creation, because miraculously, somehow, through those wounds, we are healed. A kintsugi master does not start from the mindset of, oh, this is broken, let's fix it. A kintsugi master will behold the fragments and say, this fragment is enough. In that moment, they name and appreciate that fragment and may not even think of mending it for a while. It is a singular piece, and we can find beauty in that broken piece. We see in kintsugi a process of looking at the brokenness, beholding it, naming the fractures, finding them beautiful, and then mending in a way that accentuates the fractures instead of hiding them. Something new is created. Gold is poured in, and the new design is completely dependent upon the wounds. You could say in kintsugi, in the end is my beginning. What was broken is made into something new that can be used again. This is a profound message to us in the West. In the West, we quickly discard what is broken. When we seek to do kintsugi in the United States, nobody has broken ceramics. They've already been thrown away. In addition to meaning to mend or reconnect, sugi can also mean connecting to the next generation. The connotation of kintsugi, meaning to pass along to the next generation, is appropriate and poignant when thinking about Nick, Mako said. What does it mean to be a father when the absence of your son is so painfully real? Sometimes a kintsugi master will not mend a bowl. Instead, the fragments are passed to the next generation, along with a story of who the bowl served and how it was broken. I have a Korean bowl that was taken to Japan and used in high tea. It was made in the 17th century and broke in the 18th century. The fragments were held for 2 generations before it was given to a kintsugi master to mend. It was mended in the 19th century. There's a lesson in that. Some trauma is not possible to mend right away. It takes generations. Think of the Columbine High School families, or the 9/11 families, or the survivors of countless other ground zeros around the world. Sometimes all we can do is tenderly pass the fragments down. In this way, what Nick is doing in Lament for a Son is very Eastern. If he had wanted to argue his way into suffering, he has the mind, maybe the best mind, to do that, but he chose not to. Instead, he beheld and named his emptiness, using the white space on the page to express that. His book is written like a haiku, spare, beautifully descriptive, and beautifully written. As Mako spoke about creating something more beautiful from broken pieces through doing kintsugi, I thought of a line from William Butler Yeats's poem, Crazy Jane Talks to the Bishop. Nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent. Kintsugi is that sort of bridge from creation to new creation. You cannot undo the past, Mako said, but you can mend it to make something new. That's the shift towards a kintsugi life. A kintsugi life embodies the idea of the stewardship of pain. People experience healing in our kintsugi workshops. Our culture doesn't have language for lament, yet everyone has some sort of trauma. We've all been traumatized by the pandemic. After 2020 and 2021, we're all survivors. Our kintsugi workshops have revealed that giving people simple devices, and if they don't have something broken, we just give them shells to work with is healing. They fill the cracks with putty, then sand it and add gold, and it comes out beautiful, even the first time. Trauma therapists have told us that brain neurons get rewired as a person does the physical act of kintsugi. They've said that it may take them 6 months of talk therapy to get to where our kintsugi workshops go in 2 hours. Something is awakened that our Western society, with its utilitarian and industrialized realities, has lost. Creating space where it is safe to play. We create space where it is safe to play and use your hands. Simply sanding for a long time and listening to sandpaper go over putty and ceramic is enormously healing. In our consumerist society, we do all sorts of things to numb pain. But once you give people language and a way to redirect pain that's been suppressed, beautiful things happen. I spent the 20th anniversary of 9/11 doing kintsugi. I felt I could not go back down to ground zero. I'm not over 9/11. I'm still going through it. Major pieces may have been restored, but there are still hairline fractures. I'm grateful my children are doing well, and they were at ground zero for the 20th anniversary. That says a lot about their resilience. They went with their friends, and it's beautiful to see ways the next generation may have strength I don't have. The weight of being a ground zero parent is enormous, yet the only way forward is to move into the pain. Similarly, I can imagine ways in which it was healing for Nick to put Lament for a Son together. He assembled the book like a fine carpenter working his craft, focusing on details and not trying to do everything at once. His micro focus is like sanding the pieces of kintsugi. At that particular place, during a particular time, in a particular way, Nick was dealing with his pain. He does not make grandiose philosophical statements. He doesn't go macro. Like a good craftsman, he stays in the micro. His honest grappling led him to a certain kind of understanding of his own craft. Writing that book led him in some ways to the gold. He is a good steward of his pain because of his craftsman's dedication to paying attention and telling the truth of what he experienced. Because he did this, others can easily connect with what he's done. His discipline as both a philosopher and craftsman allowed him to do something very difficult, to both experience the pain and at the same time tell us about it. That's very hard to do when you're in the middle of it. The final test of any work is it generative? Does it give birth in the reader's mind and life? A work that does this is a rare gift, and Lament for a Son does this. It's a book that endures. He didn't write the book and say, I'm all better now. Instead, he's lovingly and carefully holding the fragments and passing them on. So that's my chapter, more or less. I skipped over some parts because I didn't want to stand here and drone too long. Oh, I don't want to tell that. Hey, look at that, a standing ovation. How I wish you were book publishers.
Just because I'm with you, I happen to be not a member of the church now, but was. I've been involved with the Mary family, the Afghan family who's being supported by this church and another, and there's a lot of grief in the lives of refugees, and yet there is joy, and being accompanying them is part of it.
Thank you, yeah. Yeah, grief is a universal experience. And yet we live in a culture, a death-denying culture, a culture that tells us in so many ways to get over it, to put it behind us. So instead, this is refreshing, I think, but it's also heavy to go into. Sarah, what were you going to say?
You just now said that grief is universal, but you also pointed out that it's so individual. None of us grieve alike.
Yeah.
I can think of all kinds of things. Another thing I thought was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did a great disservice to many people.
Yeah. Yeah, Nick's not a fan of hers. She mentioned Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Oh, I don't have that. Usually we have a microphone, don't we, for talking to each other.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did the stages of grief, did a great disservice to many people.
Yeah, by prescribing that you're supposed to go through this sequence. And she's actually backed off from that. I don't know if she's still alive or not, but she backed off from that and said, well, it wasn't actually universal. Yeah.
If I can add one more
Go
thing.
ahead, Sarah.
After the big earthquake and the tsunami that happened in Japan and affected 311, we just learned recently, and it's not kintsugi because they aren't using gold, but people have collected the shards of pottery that were destroyed, and they're making earrings and jewelry out of those shards now. And the project is called Nozomi, which
Okay.
means gold.
Oh, wow. They're collecting shards from the 311 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, making new earrings, jewelry out of it, and the project is a Japanese word for hope.
It's called Nozomi.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Elaine or Sarah, both of you have lived in Japan. And Bill is here. Also, Bill is like, don't talk to me. Okay, Bill. You've lived in Japan also, so you're familiar with kintsugi? Is that something you've heard of or not? You're familiar with mako, yeah. 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 It's just fascinating how that idea of, to me, it's fascinating, the idea of new creation. What in the world does that mean in the Bible when it talks about new creation, and that can become a metaphor for it. And to say that in every experience of trauma, you can never go back. There's no reset button. You can never go back, but something new can come out of it. And it's going to be born through that great pain, but it also might have beauty to it. So, well, thank you all for being here. Mike's walking around, so it must be time to quit. So I'm going to quit. Let me say a prayer. And anybody, remember, next Sunday I'm preaching at the Protestant American Church in The Hague. So if anybody wants to join us there, you're welcome to be there. It's a pretty good sermon, I'm going to say, modestly. So, I suppose, but you'd have to get up at like, it'd probably be at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning, something like that. Let's pray. Lord, we're grateful for people like Nicholas Waltersdorf and Mako Fujimura for the experiences that you've given them and for the honesty that they have. Help us be stewards of the experiences that we've had and see one another with eyes of compassion and love. In the name of your Son, who suffered for us. Amen. Thank you all for being here this morning. We'll see you. Gretchen and I will be here for Thanksgiving. We're going away for a couple weeks. Woohoo! I didn't mean to embarrass you, Don, but it's true. He talks about that. This way, I got to do this.